Hello, hello. Welcome to section 1.3, where we're going to talk about replay protection, signing transactions and using them for unexpected, undesired purposes. So, the way that we currently protect against replay attacks is the nonce in our transaction. So, this nonce, what it does is it identifies what the transaction ordering should be for a particular sender. So, what does that really mean? We have Alice, and Alice has this address, 171. And Alice is going to sign 3 transactions. First, this transaction, and this transaction has nonce 0. That's because it's her first transaction. She'll also sign this and this. So now we've got these 3 transactions, and you'll notice the nonce 0, nonce 1, nonce 2. So this nonce tells us which transaction came first, and we're able to know this. Alice is able to tell us which transaction came first because they all originate from Alice. They're all from Alice. So let's see, there's Eve and there's Sam. These are the people that Alice is sending the message to. And there's our central operator. Alice is going to send these transactions over the interwebs, and they're all going to go in, but while they're in the series of tubes that make up the interwebs, they're going to get jumbled up. And Eve is like, I'm an impatient gerbil. I'm going to eavesdrop on these transactions, and I will actually listen to the packets, and I'm going to duplicate this transaction. I'm just going to copy paste it and then resubmit it. And I'm going to do this because I'm scared that my transaction isn't going to get through these, tubes, and I will just get lost. And so, they finally come out, and what happens is the last transaction arrives first. We don't have a guarantee that the transactions will arrive at the central operator in order. So this, you'll know, is we check the signature, it checks out, and then we check the nonce. But this is not the first transaction that Alice signed. So what we're going to do is we're going to see, okay, nonce 2, nonce 0 is what we expected. Too soon. We received it too soon. So we're not going to throw out the transaction. We're going to add it to a list of pending transactions. Then we're going to download the next one we received with the first nonce, and maybe the next one, another one as well, the one that Eve sent, the copy of the transaction. Now we're going to check those signatures. They check out, and then we're going to check the nonces. Still, it's too soon. So we're going to drop these transactions again into our list of pending transactions. So we've got a good list of pending transactions. Finally, our first transaction comes in, and we're going to check the signature, then check the nonce. Ooh, so it checks out. Thank goodness. We can finally add a transaction to our transaction history. So, great. We add it to our transaction history. We increment the nonce, and now we are going to send the actual money, right? We update the balances. And let's take a look at our pending transactions. Let's see if we actually can apply the next one. So we look here. Oh, it turns out, yes, we can. The nonce matches. And so what we're going to do is we're going to increment the nonce. Now we're going from 1 to 2, and we're going to send the money. 40 will now become 30, and we'll send it to Eve, who is bad. We'll see why later. Now, we're going to take this transaction, and we're going to be like, oh, okay, this is the duplicate. Notice that these are just direct copies of one another. And we're going to say, oh, well, this one, it matches this nonce, and so we don't actually care about this transaction. We're going to throw it out because we already have a transaction that matches nonce 1. We don't need it anymore. So now we're going to check the next one and increment our nonce and send the money, and we're good. So perfect. Everything worked out exactly as planned. Alice was able to send these 3 transactions, and no monkey business. But let's try this again without nonces. Sorry. Now, we remove the nonces, and you never know what you got till it's gone. This is going to be bad. So, we send these 3 transactions, and they get jumbled up in the tubes of the interwebs. And Eve listens once again to the transactions and duplicates it and sends a duplicate of the transaction over the interwebs again. So, same thing is happening that was happening last time. But this time, we're just going to check the signature, and we're not going to check the nonce. We will immediately include it in our transaction history because we don't have a nonce anymore. So, we're just going to increment the balance, and Alice sends 10 to Bob. Now we download the next transaction, check the signature, and include it immediately. Once again, we don't have the nonce. Well, we're going to change our balances, and ooh, something is already wrong. Notice that the way it's supposed to be is it's supposed to send first to Bob and then to Eve. Now we're sending from to Bob again. This is already the wrong transaction ordering. Alice, her intent to send to Bob, Eve, and then Bob was not fulfilled. And we now have even more danger ahead. This is not the only thing that's wrong that our nonces are protecting us against. So once again, we're going to download our transaction, this time from to Eve, and we'll check the signature and immediately include it in our transaction history. And we'll change the balances. Then we download the next transaction. Remember, this is the duplicate that Eve just sent. We're going to check the signature, and we're going to see, wait a second, include it immediately. There's nothing protecting us from including this transaction once again. That means that we've got a duplicate transaction in our history and there's nothing we're doing about it, which also means that we are going to update the balance and send twice the amount of money. We just sent to Eve 2 times. That is too much money, 2 times the amount. Now, Eve notices this. Eve is a little evil and notices that, oh, wait, I just got twice the amount and she has 10 more that she can send. Why don't I take that transaction, duplicate it again, and resubmit it to the central operator? The central operator will then check the signature and once again update the balances. We just stole money again. This is really bad, right? We just emptied Alice out. And why is this actually happening? Well, it's because Alice's signed message did not properly express her intent. She was not able to say, I only want to send 1 transaction to Eve. Instead, the operator, all they knew, because they didn't implement nonces, they thought that, it could be wanting to send infinite transactions to Eve. So this is a successful replay attack, and it's not good, clearly. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is we can say any 2 transactions in our transaction history, the hashes of those 2 transactions cannot equal each other. So this is one way to prevent replay attacks. Notice that if the hash of this comes out, it will be a unique, fingerprint of that transaction. If that matches another transaction, we'll know that these transactions must be the same, because remember, the hash of the same thing is going to equal the same thing. It's a function. So the problem is that doesn't actually give us transaction ordering. Notice that we wanted these transactions to be, first send to Bob, then send to Eve, then send to Bob. We would not get that if we just did this hash thing, because these are 2 different transactions. So at least would protect against these 2. However, what we can do is we can use nonces. So this gives us both the transaction ordering property and it protects us against the resubmission of transactions. But you know what we can also do? We can make this up to the user. So depending on who you are sending to, this is what happens in a more complicated system. In our system, we're not going to do this. But in more complicated systems, you can actually abstract this away. And you can say, okay, depending on who you're sending to, they can define their own validate function. And your transaction can include any evidence for that. So the validate function can either be check nonce, or it can be, no duplicates, which would be enforced with this transaction hashing, or it can just be always valid. We're okay with replay protection for our particular address that we're sending to. Or it can be, only valid on Sundays. It can be anything you want. And so this would be on a pure smart contract basis in a system like Ethereum. So this is called account abstraction and is actually being included in the kind of Ethereum 2.0 specification that comes in sharding. But we won't get into that too much. It's good to have it on your radar, though, because this is the real way to, allow pure customization for replay protection. So there's a bonus. Replay protection is not just between the same transaction on the same chain, but it's actually between multiple chains. So think about this. Here we have our central payment processor. Well, what if there's a fork and someone runs their own central payment processor with the exact same code, same logic, same signature scheme? What will happen? Well, we have two transactions. They both have nonces. They're normal transactions. They get submitted. Eve submits them to both of these operators, right? They're exactly duplicates. But the interesting thing is, on both of these operators, the nonce for Alice is 1. So these are actually valid transactions for both. And notice that each one of these operators have actually different balances for Alice, right? They've got 40 on this one, and she's got 25 on that one. So these are, they could be totally separate. And what you'll notice is the transactions actually will go through on each one because the nonces do actually check out. So we are able to take the same transaction and send it to each one of these operators. And guess who has an incentive to do this? Eve. Eve has an incentive to do this because Eve would receive 10 on each one of these central operators. That's good for her, so she's going to make sure to broadcast them. Now notice that this is actually not just for central operators, but this actually happened in real life with the Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. This was a fork that we forgot to include replay protection across chains. We didn't realize. So this is a very real world problem. Back a year and a half, 2 years ago, we had this problem where someone would submit a deposit to an exchange, for instance. Of course, any transaction this works with, but this was a particularly sticky case. People would try to deposit their Ethereum into an exchange, and that would go onto the Ethereum chain, and the ETH would be included in that exchange. Great. So that's normal functioning. That's exactly what should happen. However, that same transaction would then be replayed onto the Ethereum Classic chain, and now you would have not only your ETH in the exchange, but also your ETC. So, whoops, that was not intended, right? Alice was saying, I want my Ethereum to go onto your exchange. Alice was not necessarily wanting her Ethereum Classic to go onto that exchange as well. This is not intended behavior. The language which Alice was using was not descriptive enough to provide her intent for that transaction. So what did we do? Well, we added another field called the chain ID. This chain ID is different for every chain that we create. So now, future hard forks, you have a chain ID that is different. Now, what happens is what we do is we check, see, okay, does this chain ID match the transaction chain ID? If so, check that transaction checks out. And if we were to replay that transaction on a chain that had a different chain ID, we would reject it. So, boom, pow, we solved that replay protection against multiple chains. Now, what is the key takeaway here? The key takeaway is be aware when you sign messages, they can sometimes be used for unintended and malicious purposes, potentially. So that means that whenever a user is signing a transaction, they are attesting to the fact that they have a private key and they believe that the signed message is, worthwhile for them to, prove that their private key, attests to that message. And that message can be anything. And it doesn't always get used for the things that you'd like it to be used for. So when we're signing messages, may it be a state channel or, a plasma chain transaction, whatever it is, we need to make sure that we are, taking into consideration all the things that people might want to use that signed message for. Keep your wits about you. It doesn't mean, don't sign anything. Of course, signing is one of our core fundamental principles. However, it just means we have to be careful. So next up, we're going to be talking about the UTXO model, which is going to be super exciting. That's in Bitcoin. But anyway, until then, have a lovely day. All the love. Happy, 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 happy dance.